Welcome back to the New Wave Post-Punk Security Hour, where we're listening for Appsec lessons in electronic sessions. This time from Information Society's What's on Your Mind, which begins, I want to know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide, which hits the need for explainability in AI and transparency in its training data. But there's also a lesson for me, as the lyrics include, here I am in silence, looking round without a clue. Which means this week we chat with Jeevan Singh from Twilio about creating a threat modeling program that scales and succeeds in making software more secure. In the news segment, a ping of death, an encryption in iCloud, an injection with JSON, a prompt injection, an inquiry of ChatGPT, and more. Tell me what's on your mind and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
We know that many of you are looking to bolster your security posture with cloud-native app protection and XDR. So if you haven't heard of Upticks, put them on your radar. They offer both cloud and endpoint security in a single solution. Listeners can get Upticks for up to 1,000 assets for a full year for only $1. But hurry, this offer is only available through December 31st at securityweekly.com/Upticks. That's UPTYCS. Passvault is a free and open source password manager that allows your team to store, organize, and share passwords securely. Passvault is privacy first and highly versatile. It can be installed on-prem behind your firewall, used in a secure cloud, or deployed as a cloud-native application. You can check out the source code on GitHub, extend it with the REST API, integrate it with the CLI or SDKs, and even contribute. Get started with Passvault for free now. Check it out at securityweekly.com/Passvault. This is episode 223, recorded December 12th, 2022. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Akira Brand. Hello, Akira.
Hi, Mike.
Glad you have us here, wrapping up the year. John Kinsella is off this week, and he cannot be replaced by AI. He is pure, genuine intelligence. So we'll be kicking off the new year with him. We'll miss you, John. Quick announcement, follow us on Twitter for live stream reminders, highlighted clips, memes, and more. You can find us at Sec Weekly. Jeevan Singh is the Director of Product Security at Twilio, where he is embedding security into all aspects of the software development process. Jeevan enjoys building security culture with organizations and educating staff on security best practices. He's responsible for a wide variety of tasks, including architecting security solutions, working with development teams to resolve security vulns, and building out security features. Before life in the security space, Jeevan had a wide variety of development and leadership roles over the past 15 years. Hello, Jeevan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited to be on the podcast.
We're excited to have you too, because in fact, John and I had highlighted your work, your article about threat modeling. This is something really, it's exciting to me, something I really enjoy, something that John did as well, and I think something that's going to put a smile on Akira's face. But we need to know why. And so rather than reread the article, we have you here. So a couple things, let's maybe start us off with, we're going to talk about threat modeling, but start us off maybe a little bit at the beginning about not necessarily yet what threat modeling is, but the problem you saw with bringing security to development teams. What got you started on this path?
Yeah, so security engineers, we do a lot of things. We're responsible for bug bounties, pen testing, security tooling, and threat modeling and security reviews take a large portion of our time. When I sat down with security leadership, it was that segment at the time before we got acquired by Twilio. We were talking about the different challenges that the security engineering team had. And we talked about, is there a way for us to reduce the burden of threat modeling? And we really thought about the time around the early 2000s where the engineering teams started doing a little bit more quality work. They focused on quality assurance and quality engineering. And we really felt that security should be going through a similar sort of exercise where engineers should be responsible for security. So we thought about, is it possible to train engineers on threat modeling? And we went down that path. We did that experiment. We tried with some beta teams and things were pretty promising. So we're like, okay, let's try rolling it out for the entire organization, that segment. I personally trained maybe 75% of the org at that point on threat modeling, and it blew my mind. The engineers were really, really good at threat modeling. And in some instances, they were better than me at threat modeling, which was fantastic.
I love that. And I'm going to suspect that one of the reasons engineers could be better at threat modeling is that they know the code, right? They know where the bodies are buried, so to speak, and they can figure out what's wrong. But I'm curious too, before we get into some of those aspects, you're trying to scale up. You're teaching 75% of the engineers, and give us a rough sense of how many you were talking to, and then how did you approach that? Are you spending an hour individually with every engineer? Did every engineer show up for a 1 week boot camp where you took them through this? What was the approach to the training to make it successful?
Love that question. Yeah, so I think all of us have been to OWASP training or Black Hat training where they try to jam through as much information and content in a 18 or 16-hour window. Rightfully so. Those trainings are expensive and they want to provide as much value as possible. We realize that, we don't have to do that. These are engineers that work at our company. They're going to be here for months, quarters, years. So we can spread out the training a little bit more. So I rolled out 3 sets of training. The training 1 was hour and a half, training 2 was an hour and a half, and training 3 was 2 hours. And we rolled it out in a 6-week period so that we weren't overwhelming the engineers. On top of that, once the training was done, it was a lot like how I joined security and learned about security. Training is just the first part of it. The second part is actually putting it to practical use and seeing if that information worked. So what we did afterwards is we want to observe the engineers running the threat models and provide them hints and guidance that way. So the first set of trainings the first hour and a half was just on theory and a very sprinkling in a little bit of practical stuff so that they can actually use that knowledge. The second one was a lot more practical and a bit more theory. And the third one was actually a hands-on exercise. And you asked a great question about, was I spending individual time with engineers? Not that. I would love to have scoped it that much, but it would probably have taken me a couple of years to roll out the program that way. But what we did is I love the intimacy. I wanted really small groups because if anyone's similar to me, I'm always afraid to ask questions in a larger gathering. So I want to make it small enough so that people were not afraid to ask questions, want to learn more. So I try to cap it off at 8 or 10 individuals. And I tried to make sure that when we trained with the exact team that they're working on. At the beginning, it was not bad. We're rolling it out. No one had the training. But afterwards, after everyone was somewhat trained, all the new people joining the organization would get the training and they'd be training with people that weren't part of the team. But at the beginning, it was perfect because people are comfortable with their team. They're not afraid to ask questions. And it was intimate enough that they were able to voice their thoughts and opinions.
That's cool. And I'm going to have a lot of questions in a second about what you learned from the training, but let's still focus on what you were teaching, how you were educating the developers. So, maybe a dozen or so in these groups. Give us a little insight. Was this all just new hires? Were they just junior devs who you need to be taught security because senior devs know everything? And, give us a little bit of hints and insight into what this theory was from that first session.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So we, as a lot of our teams are quite well balanced. We do have folks that are staff, principal, senior principal level engineers within segment. And we do also have junior and intermediate and senior folks as well. So with that in mind, we had to build the training in a way that we're actually training the most junior folks and they get a sense of security. But we also had to make it interesting enough that the senior and staff and principal level folks are enjoying the training itself. So it's a challenging balance to do that. And on top of it, a lot of these junior folks don't have the experience that the senior staff level do. So we want to start the training with physical examples. So one of our first set of workflows, the examples that we go through is, how do you secure, I showed a picture of a home, like how do you secure a home? What are the assets within a home? And we're really making them think about that. And the goal for that particular asset in the home question is really forcing people to think of the different type of things just in general. So people bring up the home itself is an asset that we need to protect. And other will be like, no, the family, we have to protect the family. And someone might be storing gold bars in their home. So they want to protect those items. So when going through that example, it's really easy for us to relate that back to software. When you think about the home itself, you want to think about it as infrastructure. And we have to protect the infrastructure. And when we think about things that are going inside and outside the home, I relate that back to data. Data can go into your system, data can go out of your system. So it's not very different from the physical realm to the software realm. And trying to really make that connection for the junior folks or folks that have not been exposed to security reviews and threat modeling so that they are able to better understand and relate it back to their software.
That's nice. One of the things I always sort of get a little maybe prickly, hesitant when I hear metaphors, because often there's a trap that we end up discussing the metaphor, the house, and say like, oh, don't go into the basement. For if you've seen the movie Barbarian this year, for example, a great that's some great threat modeling. But we end up talking about the house rather than talking about the software. But I like you were talking about the where am I going? My mind just broke for a second. You're talking about the way of thinking, the attacker-minded thinking, the threats, the assets, very asset-oriented. So tell us a little bit a little bit more of how you make that switch from this is the house to this is the software we're building. Because as you said earlier too, suddenly things were clicking for developers about we can actually they're doing perhaps better threat modeling than the Appsec team because they know these assets, they know the windows, the second stories, the sub basements, the elevators, and all kinds of other fun metaphors within the software they have.
I love the fact that you bring up a second floor. So part of the training itself, I will show them a blueprint of a home and say, hey, what's missing as a part of this blueprint? What are we not getting? And there is stairs to another floor. And I have to bring up the fact, we talked about the controls on this floor, but the next floor might have broken windows and someone can easily get in through there. They might not have a door or something of that nature. So part of the initial training is first better understanding the workflow of threat modeling. Like when you review an architectural diagram, you as an engineer, you as a software security individual, you have to think about the actual questions that you need to be asking. And the secondary part is as we understand the workflow for the threat modeling sequence, I also talk about stride and diving deeper into stride. So my favorite part is, say, for instance, spoofing or tampering. Mm-hmm. So I might have a copy of the keys to a home. So spoofing, I'm able to make an exact copy and I'm able to go in that way. Or I can pretend that I'm Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. Maybe we have a guard in front of the home. It's a fancy home. Or maybe it's a party that we're going into the home. And I wear a mask and I show my ID and I'm on the list. So I'm able to spoof my way into the home. So showing them different ways of how we break into the actual security vulnerability classifications and showing them exactly how a particular vulnerability is there. And then we actually go and relate it to actual software vulnerabilities and talk about spoofing as well as how brute force or credential stuffing or different ways that you can actually spoof a different user in your software system as well.
Very cool. So you spent some time. You spent close to six sessions, three sessions, close to 6 hours of this. And Mission Impossible, a good 2 hour long movie. Ocean's 11 series has some great threat modeling in there. Also 2 hour movies. Threat modelings can go on and on and on. especially if somebody's new to it, they can get excited, rightly so, I think, about, oh, here are all the very specific, detailed ways this house or this software could be taken apart. What do you do to sort of rein the developers in if they get overexcited, they're spending a lot of time, or tell them perhaps the opposite end of the spectrum, we don't need to now spend another 6 sessions and, several days on threat modeling this one single app? How do you get that time-bound aspect of it?
Yeah, I love that question because as security professionals, we can get really deep into the weeds if we need to, and we can remediate things that don't really require remediation. So everything is a balance. And as part of our threat modeling template, so part of the threat modeling training is also training the individuals to make sure that they can lead threat modeling sessions. Mm-hmm. And we have a threat modeling template where we first focus on the scope. And we want to know how do we scope it well so that we are not diving into the weeds when we don't need to, or we're not scoping it too narrow and we should scope it a little bit further. So after the training goes through and the first time the DRI, the directly responsible individual, has to do a threat modeling session, before they actually schedule the threat model, they'll submit the ticket. He'll get assigned to a security engineer, whomever's on call that day. And that security engineer will sit down with the developer, make sure that they understand what their responsibility is as part of the threat modeling process. So we have a template. They fill in parts of the template, and they have the scoping part of it, and we make sure it's scoped well, with the goal that eventually these individuals will know how to scope it themselves. So we definitely want to continue that training even after the actual theoretical portion has done. We want to make sure that the practical side, where we actually have them lead the threat modeling training, we're continuously working with them so that they can get better and be more refined when they do their threat modeling themselves.
That's got to be really cool self-service aspect. Getting into the idea of measuring the success of this or demonstrating success is just seeing that they're relying less on that Appsec on-call person to review, to double-check the work. So when you also mentioned at the very beginning, talking to security leadership, that we need to scale, we need to reduce this burden on Appsec. So then what is the follow-up conversation you have with security leadership? Or they say, well, justify your existence, perhaps not so unfriendly manner, but in the sense of, you've got a program here. Is it better? Is it working? Is it successful? What were some ways you were pointing to that as showing this approach to threat modeling as education is working?
Yeah, I love that question. So we came up with the training right when COVID was hitting. So it was March-ish. We rolled it out to our beta teams, March 2020. April is when we're ready to start looking at other teams. And one of the big things as security professionals is really, you take advantage of working in an office. You sit in the middle of things. You can hear the chatter going around. You jump into conversations. And we didn't have any of that in a remote world. No one was really DMing us of their water cooler chats and stuff like that. So one of the things that we noticed is that once we rolled out the training, the security culture in itself changed at Segment. And for the better, obviously. So we've noticed that people started approaching us more often. We had a lot more engagement in our security channels within Segment. So that was one of the, it wasn't a hard metric, but it was a soft metric that helped us understand that things are going in the right direction. We had a few other things that we wanted to measure. Over time, we had assumed that the number of high and critical vulnerabilities discovered in pen testing as well as bug bounty would go down over time as teams started to threat model themselves. As we start looking at more and more things and we threat model more and more, the number of higher impact issues would decrease, and we would have to make sure that we were paying more for our bug bounties and enticing folks just in general. Another metric that we were looking at was we'd assumed that the dev velocity would increase as well. So
interesting.
How does that make sense? Like if if you're adding more processes to the SDLC, how's it going to improve developer velocity? Well, developers no longer have to wait for a threat model. They can go ahead and do it themselves. Since they're threat modeling mostly everything, they should have fewer critical and high vulnerabilities. So they're not doing as many security fixes. And hopefully in those situations, they're not making any architectural changes after the fact, after a bad vulnerability is discovered. So we're hoping that when rolling this out, there will be a win-win-win. It's easier to quantify some things than others. The engagement was easy to see. We see a lot more Slack requests, a lot more people DM me. It was harder to notice the trend in the high and critical vulnerabilities within Bugcrowd and Pentest because we hired a lot more developers at the same time and we're expanding Segment. Twilio made a massive investment and want to push more on Segment. It was harder just in general to sort of discover these vulnerabilities. The metrics, just because the landscape had changed so much.
The metrics are always that challenge, which is also one of the reasons I like to ask the question because it typically highlights that art versus science more so. One of the things that I've noticed you haven't mentioned is tooling. Now, you did mention, for example, like a template. So, developers had a template so this, on-call Appsec could help review and just make sure there's, a baseline quality for the threat models being done. And over time, that quality, you see that develop and it just becomes more self-service, more trust goes into the developers. The shift left is the word of the year for that one. But other tools? So, why this omission? I'm curious. What was working or not working for you? What's your favorite threat modeling tool?
Yeah, I think my favorite threat modeling tool is a whiteboard. Mostly because when I started in the security industry, I started using some of the threat modeling tools, and they can be overwhelming. You make a very simple server-to-client diagram, and you may get 24, 30 different threats that come out of it. And for someone that's more junior, that could be overwhelming, whereas a senior staff individual, they'll be able to know and discount a bunch of those vulnerabilities. So, and we want to do the same within the organization as well. When we rolled out the training, we really wanted folks to focus on diagramming, whiteboarding these items because we had some nefarious plans as well. While we wanted people to learn threat modeling, we also want them to become mini security engineers. So if we are able to deploy 75-80% of engineers to become mini security engineers, we knew that our security posture will be growing significantly. And so that's actually what ended up happening because one time, I remember this was a while ago, Segment, part of their backend is on Node. There was a Node high vulnerability that came out, and one of our engineering managers on the East Coast, most of our security engineers were on the West Coast at that time, but one of the engineering manager, he went through the security training. He became a good security champion. He discovered that high vulnerability. He noticed that one of his systems had it, so he patched it up. And then he pinged the other two folks that were also on the East Coast, letting them know that they should patch up their vulnerabilities, and they had tickets in for it. This was all before any of us woke up on the West Coast. So it was quite impressive that making sure that we went from whiteboarding and less tools to really get folks to become mini security engineers and actually go ahead and make security changes for the benefit of the organization without security even being involved.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful example of what you were saying, security culture. Obviously, we can't qualify it other than saying, asking, well, are you able to sleep until 10 p.m. now rather than 9:30 or 10 a.m.? But anyway, that's highlighting security culture, having that appreciation of what's out there from the engineers. Wonderful example. And here I'm going to take now a different direction and about what you learned? Because I know too, like Akira, for example, she works in a DevRel space. She talks with developers quite a bit. You talked with developers here, Jeevan, on threat modeling. Developers like Appsec folks have opinions. They say, well, maybe this is working, this isn't working. What was some of the feedback you got that you would share, or lessons learned that you would share for others who are on the conducting side of that training?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on the conducting side first, definitely make sure that there's more than one trainer. So after rolling out the training for 2 quarters, I got kind of bored with the training, and I didn't want to roll it out any further. So I trained the trainers after the fact, where I should have done it beforehand. That's definitely one. And another is as going through the threat modeling itself, we talked a little bit about it at the beginning, where the engineers themselves are much, much better at it than we are. They do know where the bodies are buried, and they can sort of point to those once they sort of discover how to look for security. One of the big key points that I noticed in the training, I sort of did the same thing that Black Hat and OWASP did, where I try to send too much information to the developers. So at the very beginning, I had some beta teams to test through it, and I probably tried to squeeze 2 hours of training in an hour and a half. And it's going really, really fast. So I learned a lot so I did the beta training. I made sure that after every hour and a half, I spent 15 minutes talking to the engineers that had time to talk more about the training and the things that they liked and they didn't like. And the pacing was something that I really learned from it. So now for those hour and a half trainings, I want to make sure that we have hour 15 of content. And then I dive into some stories, security stories, to relate things a lot better. So for spoofing, I'll talk about some challenges that I've seen in my past and how attackers were able to gain foothold, so that it relates a lot more and more deeply with them. And so those are some of the minor changes that I made as part of the training.
That's cool. And was there the as you're going through that, were there certain things that surprised you in terms of the questions that developers were asking, or the areas that they were focusing on, in the sense of, here's a threat that they are thinking of that could be easily dismissed because they missed this, the threat isn't as terrible as they think it is, or something more interesting perhaps that surprised you in that, oh, I never thought of that. I'm glad you brought that up. And, slacking into the Appsec team in the background, hey, we need to add this to our list.
Yeah, I have 2 answers for that. I didn't think of that. So the first one was, one of the things that I really encourage the individuals that are running the training is getting everyone involved. So if someone's leading, I always try to make sure that they have a backup, and that backup is DMing folks to get involved. One particular time, it was me being the backup, and it was one of the individuals that I actually started the same day when I was at Segment. That was his first job out of college, and I DM'd him. I'm like, hey, I'd love your opinion. Make sure that you're bringing up some thoughts. And he definitely brought one up where it caught me off guard, because I had immediately dismissed it just because, given the experience I had in general, but that was wrong. I should not have dismissed this, because it was definitely a valid issue and a valid finding. So that was a great lesson that I learned with respect to that. Another instance was that the developers, they get so deep into things that it reminds me sort of like a DAS scan versus a pen test. DAS scans, they get at the very highest level when you do the actual scan, whereas pen test, you can really dive much, much deeper. So when I threat model, I'm more of like a DAS scanner. I come in, I know very little about the systems, and I go a very cursory glance at things, whereas some of these developers, they went so deep that it would take me days to have actually discovered that particular vulnerability. And we want to make sure that we're only scoping it responsibly, so we're not going that deep. So yeah, those are great lessons learned, where we want to get everyone involved. It doesn't matter if it's junior or senior. But we also want to make sure that we have people that are deeply knowledgeable of the system, and they can go much, much deeper than anyone that comes from the outside.
Yeah, and that seems to be an underlying theme, is that the developers have that deep knowledge, that deep context of systems, and perhaps they just need to be nudged, given a little bit of that information about that what could go wrong. What are the things that either you don't have the time to finish that already that you're worried about, or with a little bit of education, where is that spoofing, that tampering, that those RCEs might be hiding. You also mentioned, you want to include everyone, and this came across my radar from your blog post. But in the spirit of including everyone, you've got some of this material is now freely available. Tell us a bit more about that, or how would you like some more collaboration from the Appsec community?
So. We're very fortunate that the lawyers had let us open source this. We took out a lot of the segment-specific content from it, but we made it very generic. And what we realized is that there wasn't much content out there when it comes to threat modeling training. And we didn't think anyone should have to build it from scratch. It didn't make any sense, especially if we can make it generic. And even today, I had a friend that messaged me and saying, "Hey, did you ever open source that training?" So crazy coincidence, but he pinged me and I'm like, "Yeah, use these trainings." The point of the trainings is to get it out into the community, have the community look at it. I did the best I could, but I'm hoping that there are individuals out there that are way smarter than me that can take that training to that next level. So that, and then reshare it to the community, because the goal is to not only secure our companies, but the goal is to secure the community in itself. If we can share and collaborate and build out training that works really well, let's do that. So I'm definitely, selfishly, I'm really looking forward to someone taking my training and making it better and sharing it out so I can steal from that and use it internally as well.
No, absolutely. And I think part of it too is you're describing those generic aspects that, yes, there's a lot of aspects of what is a threat, what are the threat, what are the attackers, what do these attack scenarios look like? We could bring in the metaphors of a house, or perhaps a large zoological park on an island where the power goes out and people start getting eaten by the fauna there. But there's also the relevance, and I think you did mention some of the things that had to be taken out, because for obvious reasons, I think everyone can realize that. But it's a little bit unfortunate you have to do that, except for the fact that other environments perhaps don't have Node on the back end. They have different tech stacks. And that's where I'm going with that conversation, is making it relevant. So I'm curious how much of what you can share, what was that journey to making those specific parts relevant for the engineers, rather than just like, what are you working on today, so that it's not too narrowly focused, just what your examples are for them?
Yeah. Great question. It really helped when speaking to Stride and type of vulnerabilities, so that we can actually point back for a couple of reasons. One, we want to show folks that we're not perfect. There are a ton of different vulnerabilities within our systems, and this is sort of how we categorize all of this. I also want to point out that we are nearly ready to start rolling this out at Twilio scale. So segment scale was pretty easy. There's 150, 200 engineers at the time. There's a lot more now. But it was easy to roll out. But we're looking at rolling it out to the Twilio scale, a couple thousand engineers. But we're also, Twilio has many different frameworks. It's not homogeneous, like Segment is. So we're looking at actually diving deep into specific areas and specific frameworks within Twilio when we do our training and our content, so that it makes a lot more sense, much more relevancy for those individuals as well.
Yeah, I'm curious to that aspect, because I did mention in the beginning, timeout scaling, and this is your time that, as you were, it didn't sound like you were quite getting burned out, but you're definitely getting, I think you did use the word bored, but that was a lot of training for 150 engineers. And now, give us a sense of perhaps just scales, in the sense of how much of you training engineers, or that Appsec to engineer sort of ratio, just to get an idea of why this is so important.
Yeah, so at Segment at that time, so this was a couple of years ago when I rolled out the training itself. It was probably a 1 to 12 ratio, engineers to
Luxury.
security. Yeah, absolutely. So our security engineering arm within Twilio, we call it R&D user security. It's about a 1 to 50 now, but not all aspects of it is product security. So the product security side, it's probably actually I can't do the math in my head, but it's considerably worse. But we will be pulling in cloud security or enterprise security, maybe even folks from our GRC teams to help us roll out the scaling. But we're going to be really focused when we roll things out within Twilio. That's what we learned, that we can't roll it out for the entire business at one time. We want to roll it out to areas that are very important to the business need. And also, we also want to make sure that we're looking at the risk aspect of it as well. Where are the areas that are the riskiest? And we should be providing training there so that these folks can help themselves and burn down the risk themselves.
One of the aspects of just in terms of terminology, like you did mention Stride, let us talk about risk for a second, because risk is one of those things that I'll repeat myself by saying more art than science. So, as part of the threat modeling, did you make everyone go through their CVSS v3 calculators and say exactly this is a 9.2, and if anybody was threat modeling 4.7 or below, they get kicked out of class for not thinking well? What does the risk discussion look like in this threat modeling class?
Yeah, I love that question in general. We didn't dive into too much of the actual scoring systems. I'm a big fan of CWSS v1, which is very similar to CVSS v3. But we want to make it easy for the engineering team to just rate it with their gut initially, with further discussions on what our scoring system is. We have settled on CVSS v3 for Twilio. It's a bigger scale, so can't go as niche on your scoring systems there. We actually walk them through how you can think about risk and what do they consider as critical, high, medium, low. But usually immediately after a threat model, we want to rate all of the vulnerabilities there. Mm-hmm. So say if you have 10, we want to order them in the highest priority to lowest priority. But we also want engineers to be smart enough, to be trained well enough that they know which vulnerabilities we're going to fix versus which ones we're not going to fix. That conversation is important because we can't fix all the things. It doesn't make any business sense in order to do that. So really working with them, trying to hone their skills on determining which ones that they absolutely must fix before they actually deploy these features into production.
Oh, what an exciting conversation to have. Security not being an absolute that all known issues must be resolved immediately and forever. That's a wonderful conversation. I imagine that might have been something like a surprise to engineers, or at least one of those more welcome conversations with them in terms of just this is the priority we're going for.
Absolutely. It was definitely a welcome conversation. And we like to think of ourselves not as no for security. It's usually no, but when we think about it this way, so we have that ongoing conversation with engineering. It's not absolute. Nothing is absolute with the security team here.
Well, I don't want to say, no, we can't keep going, but we are getting close on time here, Jeevan. You've joined us as a wonderful guest for wrapping up the year. You pointed to, there's community, some open source material for this threat modeling. As people think about their 2023 plans, whether it's education, threat modeling, et cetera, is there something you'd love to point people towards, or just, have more collaboration on to help with what you're aiming for here?
Yeah, I love if folks will read the blog, look at the training material, take the training material, use it, see what works, what doesn't work, provide me feedback. We're definitely looking at scaling this at the greater level at Twilio in 2023. Anyone that has done this sort of training also at that scale would love to chat with you all. So hit me up, or even hit me up if you have just general questions in general about this training. I set up a alias just for this. So it's SSTM, self-service threat modeling, at segment.com. That will hit me up. And I can, if you have any sort of questions, or hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm at Ask Jeevan Singh on Twitter. I love talking about threat modeling. I really am passionate about it. I feel that having more and more engineers focusing on it will make all of our softwares much more safer for the future. So I'm more than willing to have conversations, learn more from you, how you're doing it, so that we all get to a better place in the community.
And we also love talking about threat modeling and learning from your very specific hands-on examples of what it was like to do the education, to actually do that scaling. So thank you so much, Jeevan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I want to thank Akira as well, and thank all of our listeners. We'll make sure that we have all of his contact information on our show notes so you can provide that feedback or continue that conversation throughout the year and into 2023. With that, we do need to take a quick break and return with news of the week.